Good morning to our viewers and listeners. Welcome to this press conference with Your Excellency, the Governor Andrew Pierce. And Governor Pierce will be speaking to us on a number of topics and, of course, the recent Joint Ministerial Council JMC meeting, which was recently held in the United Kingdom. Your Excellency, I'm just going to cross over to you now to give your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, James. Welcome, everybody, to the office here, Governor's office. I wanted to kick off really with a few words about three things. The first is my usual family favourite of COVID. So I hope people won't mind me just taking a little bit of time on that subject. Nearly 2 years into this pandemic, and we're approaching Christmas, the second Christmas in the grip of this disease. And I think it would be fair to say that Montserrat is in a relatively good place. We now have no active cases on Ireland, and we've got a pretty proven and robust system of entry controls in place and our own testing system up and running. So a real thanks again from me to all involved in that, in particular in our Ministry of Health, but also more widely in the immigration authorities and the police. Everybody's pulled together and done a really fantastic job to get us into that relatively happy position. But COVID is not over, sadly, and in particular the new variant, the latest new variant, Omicron, is a worrying one. It has a number of mutations in it which have the scientists and experts worrying that it could be more infectious, more rapidly transmissible, could actually be more lethal or have a more serious effect, and it could be more resistant to the current suite of vaccines that have been developed. We can't say, that isn't known. More time is needed still for the data to come through to be able to say that, but the initial concern from the nature of these mutations is clearly serious, and we have now already seen it jump into 50 or more countries. And I think in the UK we're approaching 400 cases, if I read the data correctly. So that's still very small compared to the Delta, the dominant Delta variant, but it's growing fast. So the long and short of all that is we need to keep up our guard here in Montserrat still. We are in a relatively strong place, but we absolutely need to keep up our guard. And the key thing for us in that is vaccination and boosters. We now have a super cold freezer, and Pfizer vaccine, which needs a super cold freezer, is on its way to us. We understand should be here next week. Thank you very much to UK counterparts in the FCDO in particular for their fantastic support for Montserrat and all the OTs with this sort of equipment and support and advice. It's really appreciated. Key for us is we mustn't waste this opportunity. So this is a real plea from me. I know people are fed up with hearing me talking about COVID, and I appreciate that. It's a frustrating subject, but please do think hard about vaccination and in particular boosters. The strong, clear, unequivocal advice from the world's experts. These are people who've spent their lives studying these pandemics. They're experienced. They don't have axes to grind. These are people whose heart is in the right place in the world. The WHO, PAHO, the UK's medical and regulatory authorities, their counterparts in the US and EU, all to a man and woman are urging and pleading with people to take the vaccines and the boosters. We must do this, and it's to protect ourselves and our families and our friends and the community as a whole. It's not just a sort of personal matter, ourselves alone. In doing it, in thinking about that, I'd ask people please to think about it here. Please would people also not be distracted by the multitude of fake and false news that circulates on social media on this and so many other subjects. I know it is complex, I know it's difficult to sometimes discern what is truthful and what isn't, but the truth rests in the WHO and PAHO and the UK medical authorities. It does not rest in Joe Bloggs, who's been down the pub and wants to put something on social media about what he thinks about what may be going on next door or in the next door village. It does not rest with those people. Please ignore it. Don't click on it. It's a waste of time. Please, please read the experts' views. So that's my strong plea on COVID. The next thing I wanted to just raise was the FAM, the Financial Aid Mission. I know Montserrat and colleagues are well versed in this annual event. It's a sort of budget setting event, so it matters a lot for Montserrat. It fixes our recurrent budgetary support for the year ahead, and to some degree for the 2-3 year envelope ahead. And the team from the UK are coming out. In fact, they arrive here tomorrow. They then have to spend a bit of time in isolation, obviously, 5 days in isolation, and then they burst out on the scene here for face-to-face meetings on Wednesday and Thursday next week, and finish on Friday with our closing press conference, our usual closing press conference on the emerging findings of the FAM. And then they fly back to the UK, all being well, on Friday evening next week. I don't want to steal the thunder of any of that. There's an excellent programme that's been drawn up by the Ministry of Finance here in consultation with the whole government of Montserrat and with the UK team. I think we've commented before that the mood music is that it's likely to be what they call a flatline settlement. So basically we're not in the market for a big increase in what we get or a big decrease. That's actually a pretty lucky position when you look at the pressure on public finances, and in particular ODA in the UK. So we're looking at that, but that doesn't mean there's no interest for us, because there is a lot of scope, or quite a lot of scope, for rebalancing and reprioritising within the budget framework we have. Tariff income here for the government is going up encouragingly, even despite COVID. We do carry quite a lot of vacancies in our public sector, and the budget element for travel and courses overseas and things by public servants is clearly not so heavily used, can't be in the COVID era. And we enter this year with all our international subscriptions fully paid up, which is a happy position, following the modest surplus in the closing quarter of last financial year, which enabled us to do that. So in some respects, it's not to say we're wealthy, we're certainly not that, but we have a little margin in the budget, which perhaps enables this FAM to discuss and agree some reprioritisation, even within the flatline envelope. That's the sort of recurrent budget side. FAM deals with the recurrent budget primarily, but right now, clearly, there are also some significant capital concerns for Montserrat. We have a sewage works which is causing some problems, as Dr. Sami and the Premier have noted. There are also electrical generation challenges, which Dr. Sami has recently been on the radio, I know, explaining in some detail. And there are also some deeper issues with our water supply that need attention, the maintenance of some reservoir equipment. So we have a nexus of issues around our public utilities that will need attention, and our small scale, relatively small scale capital expenditure. They will need to be looked at and are being looked at as well to see where we can help. And in that context, the CIPREG programme, that's the programme for infrastructural repair and upgrade, which is now into its third year, has been doing well. The airport, the control tower, which looks really smart, I must say, with its nice coat of paint, the fibre optic connection, those are all important things. The big chunky item that's coming out of this CIPREG programme, £30 million programme, is the hospital. I know people are frustrated with the length of time it's taken to really shift that, but that is now really moving forward. It's now at the phase of preparing for detailed design, and the outline designs we've seen, I think, look really good, really attractive mix of Caribbean character, Montserratian character, and best-in-class type functionality for a hospital of that scale. So it's a really good thing. That and the port, where there's ongoing work to close the funding gap so we can clinch and move forward on the port. Those are two really major projects for Montserrat. We're probably talking, what are we talking, 20, 30, we're talking something like 45, 50 million pounds sterling combined projects injected into our economy, with two critical nodes for life on the island here in the coming 1 to 2/3 years, 3 years probably. That's a big stuff. I know COVID casting a shadow, and ODA pressures perhaps cast a smaller shadow, but those two items coming into the frame that they are, I think is very good news for Montserrat. And then on COP26, climate change, the Glasgow conference has happened. Sometimes after these big summits, the mood can be a little anticlimactic. In this case, I think Glasgow, by any measure, was a hugely successful summit at a critical moment. It's not perfect. It didn't do everything that in a council of perfection we would have wanted, but it's really shifted the dial in international awareness, cohesion and commitment. This incredible commitment to stop deforestation, very powerful commitment on fossil fuels, phasing out our use of those, and powerful commitments too on carbon dioxide reduction, emissions reduction, and perhaps in particular the sense of the mood of the meeting. There are clearly some outliers, some individuals, countries who have different interests and maybe a little slower pace than others, but the collective mood was really powerful. This is humanity talking about an existential threat. So now, moving forward, delivery is the name of the game. Here in Montserrat, in my office, never a day passes without me getting extensive, complex briefing on follow-up and delivery around these different climate change commitments. The UK is handing over to Egypt as the next president, and that's great. It'd be really good to have a country like Egypt bringing a fresh pair of eyes to this. For Montserrat, there are big opportunities. I know we touched on this a little bit in our last meeting, but on the back of that sort of shift in international opinion is a lot of money. And we're not just talking, 5 or 10 million, we're talking hundreds of billions of pounds. That's for the world as a whole. But what it does mean is that any projects, any development in Montserrat that we can rightly and fairly badge as being part of the COP26 train, the green agenda, we've got a huge new potential array of funds that we can look to for support. So any part of it, whether it's solar, wind, geothermal, whether it's making our estate more efficient, more cheaper to run, more solar powered, we can press a button and fix our shutters if a hurricane's coming and not have people having to climb up on ladders and nail up boards and things. Those sorts of things can be badged as part of the COP26 train, and that's a really important area for Montserrat, that. And then just finally, sorry, I have talked a little bit more than perhaps I expected there, but just finally, I'm conscious that today our ZJB colleagues in particular are putting out a lot of testimonials for Mr. David Edgecombe, who's sadly passed away. He's not somebody I knew personally. I think he was probably in Canada, I believe, until he passed. So, was it? Sorry, yes, but not here. But it's evident from what I've heard, people like Sir Howard Fergus and others commenting that he was a very talented man, a man of arts, a playwright in particular here. And I remember my wife and daughter and I, we were very lucky to attend a fantastic play when we first arrived in Montserrat, done by Mr. Cumberbatch. It's a brilliant play that still sits in our minds, enacted entirely by Montserratans, who were fantastic natural actors and actresses. It was really powerful. So I haven't seen a production from Mr. Edgecombe, but I saw that one, and it sort of brings across, I think, the talent that Montserrat has. I understand also he was a very good, kind person, and that, if I may say so, that combination of quiet, understated talent and kindness is a very Montserratian thing, very quintessentially Montserratian. So it's a big loss to the community, but also he was a family man, and of course family will be particularly upset and grieving, and I know our own Basil Chambers, I think Mr. Edgecombe was his stepfather. So I just wanted to finish by offering my personal condolences and sincere sympathy to all Mr. Edgecombe's family and friends, and all in our community here in Montserrat. Thank you very much, folks. Over to you, colleagues.
Thank you, Governor. All right, let me start on the SUPREG side. I'm actually more interested in often what happens with funding is that everybody likes big buildings, infrastructure, but there's a softer side that's often left unmet. I'm wondering if there's any scope in SIPREG or even going forward, whether it's part of the FAM discussions or other areas, where FCDO is going to give some serious consideration to how it supports other aspects of Montserrat life. I think one of the big gaps is our non-profit sector or the non-governmental organizations, which can really serve to fill gaps that are often left unserved. Is there any scope for, or any of the discussions happening around this? Because you also mentioned looking at COP26. I think non-governmental agencies probably have an opportunity there to be able to channel some funds that wouldn't normally go to, let's say, a government agency. Are there any discussions happening around how support can be given to this other side of Montserrat life that doesn't get much support?
No, thank you. It's a good question. I think in frankness in general, that side of life, the sort of civil society side of life here, reflecting the balance of constitutional responsibilities, tends not to be such a focus for funding discussion, because it's something that tends to need to come more from the community itself, and is part of the community's own character and sense of priorities. So I haven't seen it discussed in quite the way you framed the question there, but it's a good point you raise, and it's something I will feed into the FAM. But if you take particularly your point about the COP26 follow-through, I mean, not perhaps necessarily a direct linkage, but if you take, it was our last press conference here, I think we had the UK support through Darwin or Darwin Plus for the wildlife and fauna and flora protection here, indigenous protection. It's not a massive sum of money. If I recall, it's a couple of £100,000 UK pounds, something of that order, but it's quite a useful sum. And that's essentially supporting real grassroots activity. It's people, with their backyards, in some cases literally, and the Cork Hill group are looking to resuscitate the original vegetation in the Cork Hill area. So that's an example of that sort of project. The Mountain Chicken Project, it's Durrell. Durrell's a private foundation, but there is some UK governmental support, I believe, for that too. Yes.
If we, so let's consider not just the environmental side. How about the social side in terms of our senior citizens, our youth programs? Because a lot of times they're getting funds, maybe a little bit of a stipend from our social services department, but it's not enough to actually run these organizations so they can consistently have full-time staff and programming. And I think there are these gaps. Is there any consideration? How would we go about maybe beginning to have more intentional conversations around how we can get UK support to build our capacity in these areas?
Well, no, thank you. I think those are good points. I was sort of commenting particularly on environment because you'd flagged the COP26, but I take that. I think from what my wife and I have seen here in Montserrat, I mean, it can be very tough for young people too in an island with relatively limited job opportunities. But it's certainly tough for our older compatriots, and I agree. I think there is a case for some restructuring. When you look at the way we operate the Golden Years home, which is sort of partly governmentally supported and partly trust supported, and its linkage with Margetson and to some extent with the facility in Lookout, I think some clarification of the lines of responsibility and support would be helpful there. But I make that comment in a more personal capacity because strictly that is a devolved area for Government of Montserrat, and it's not one where we'd be very happy to, I'm sure, to come in and see what we can do, but it's primarily for elected leaders to lead in their ministries on that area. But I know what you mean, and I think my wife happens to visit the Golden Years quite regularly. She's quite close to that, and people try really hard. People are nice. Everyone tries hard to sort of keep things jolly and happy for our older people. But there can be long days, particularly with COVID, when people are very alone and sit alone for long times. I'm being frank in what one sees there, and I think something that the community can do to enrich and enliven life for our older folks, intellectually and spiritually, would be good. I agree with that.
Your Excellency, just continuing a little bit against that background in terms of the financial aid mission. And you did mention earlier that there might not be, or there might be increases or decrease in funding, but you also touched on capital projects, and you spoke of public utilities and so on. Can you just explain how this will pan out when you look at what you've said in terms of there might not be increases or decreases with new spends when we have issues with public utilities, and I'm talking about water, electricity, what have you?
No, thanks. It's a very good question. I mean, without boring your listeners and with the finer details of the funding, but if you take the CIPREG program, Capital Infrastructure Repair Program, that was a £30 million program, kicked off towards the end of 2019, summer 2019. It's already largely committed. If you take out what we spent on the airport, there's what they call a hot mix machine, like a tarmac machine on its way here, and the school repairs, secondary school repairs, and you take out roughly £15 million, which is the sort of notional figure to complete the hospital project, which is going very well. You're left with something in the order of £2+ million, between 2 and 3. Much of which needs to be used for what they call technical capacity support, I think. So things like, if you take geothermal, the technical expertise needed to consider how you regenerate those wells and prepare for them to be used. So there's very little flex. There may be tiniest amounts, but in the 30 million capital program, to all intents and purposes, it's pretty well committed. If you take the FAM, the annual budget support, there's a small component of that each year which is put into a thing called SCAF, Small Capital Assets Fund. I think that is less than £1 million. So if you take those two combined, you've not really got enough monetary firepower to bite fully on the sort of sums that look to be needed for the electrical generation issues and the sewage. Sorting the sewage systems out. Some of those in the past have been dealt with by Basic Needs Trust Fund. In fact, I think the particularly leaky sewage plant in Drummonds is a BNTF funded project. So the question that needs to be addressed now is how we handle those sort of intermediary capital support programs. I think they're above the SCAF, but they're below the level. With the CIPREG, it doesn't have enough uncommitted funds. So clearly we're going to need to look hard at that, and we're going to need some imaginative solutions. And as Dr. Sami was saying, there's a particular issue on electricity that it's politically and optically quite difficult to expand a diesel power generating system a month after COP26 has committed people to phasing that out. So we have a number of factors to bring into play, and those are going to be one of the issues discussed in the face-to-face meetings on, it's either Wednesday or Thursday next week.
That is where I was getting, if that was, a part. When we look at new spends, there might be some flexibility in that. But we're moving on to COP26, and I think I'm hearing, if my memory serves me correctly, that our geothermal project that the British government, is not, willing at this time to fund that geothermal project any further. You mentioned opportunities for Montserrat from COP 2026, and you mentioned the 100 billion pounds worldwide.
More than that.
Yeah, well, let's look at how Montserrat would be able to benefit from your point of view.
Well, so sort of two parts perhaps. I mean, on geothermal, I don't think I'm breaking a confidence in saying that the steering committee, that's a sort of UK Government of Montserrat combined high-level committee that makes judgment calls on priority strategic funding, has agreed, it's modest expenditure on the maintenance and sort of viability assessment of two of the three wells, the first two. The third, I gather, has some sort of deep collapse problem with mud. I don't fully understand the technicalities of it, but it's basically the third is a bit more problematic. But the first two, so we have agreed funding for that. It's not many millions, but it is a useful sum to help us get to the point of viability of those first two wells. Then you're absolutely right. I mean, there's different positions, aren't there? Some people, their instincts are that this needs to be private sector, that the scale of investment needed in the current climate means it needs to be private sector driven, and you need a careful sort of public-private sector partnership that takes that forward in a way that benefits all parties. And that certainly needs to be explored, and that is officially the path that is now being explored. There are also views that in something like geothermal, particularly on a small island, there's a benefit where you can do it in having a bigger element of public funding. That's to help guard against sort of monopoly price gouging over time, and this sort of problem. I suppose this is a personal comment. My own preference in a world where we could choose would be to have a partnership where the capital input was more balanced between public and private sectors, because of what I've seen in my own professional life around the world when you go entirely to the one direction. But as it stands, the UK government has committed some further funding to help put the two of the three wells into a position where they can be sort of almost marketed, I suppose you'd call it, and the plan is to test then for public-private partnership. Where it's really moved since we last tried that is when we were talking about this, actually when I first came, it was all about the power generation, and the big issue was relaying the power to St Kitts or Antigua. Now a significant element is this mining the brine. It's a significant component of geothermal in many places because the critical strategic minerals like lithium are deep 1.5 kilometres underground in molten brine, and technology has advanced hugely. So that's that's the sort of turnkey for us in Montserrat as well. So we shouldn't think just energy.
Governor, I'm going to switch a bit to your role in responsibility for the civil service. There have been some recent changes in the HRMU office. I understand that the CHRO has been whether removed from that role or transitioned to a different position, and a TC is currently acting as CHRO. The head of learning also, her contract was not renewed. Could you give us some details about what's happening in HRMU? Also, there doesn't seem to be a culture across government, not just HRMU, to really communicate to the public about senior hires, which I think is really critical, that people know who are sitting in these roles. What can we do about improving that level of communication so the public knows who is actually employed to deliver the services?
Right. Thank you. I mean, the sort of picking those up in a somewhat random order. The learning and development one I'm not cited on, I'm afraid. I don't know that one, so I can't really comment on that. The head of HR, the CHRO, has for the moment transitioned from that job, and she's doing a different piece of work, an important piece of work in the DG's office. That is sort of quite a normal move in the public service. Not every time anybody moves in the public service needs to be some sort of formal open recruitment process. There is also a need in good public service management, sometimes for what they call managed moves, where decisions are taken for a range of reasons to move people into important other jobs. So that's what's happened there with that particular position. I wasn't aware that of any current recruitment for that position. I think we haven't quite yet decided what to do about that. There's still a bit of discussion to finalise what's the best way forward. So, my understanding is that we still need a little bit of discussion to finalise how best to go forward with HR. Part of that is because with some of the reforms that are very complicated here, we had planned to use the TC process to bring in an expert in public service reform. And then for various reasons, some other work has needed to be done more quickly, and we've sort of slightly changed our mind on the best possible approach. So there's still a little bit more work and discussion needed to bottom that out. But when it comes to who does what senior job here, I mean, if and when it comes to the time that any permanent secretary level position, and that one is that, it's a permanent secretary level position, needs to be sort of permanently replaced, then I think we have to advertise that, and then we report afterwards, who's been appointed and who sits in those jobs. So I'm not being defensive at all. We will certainly look at the process for communication. If you feel it's not right, then we have to listen to that. But at the moment, no decision's been taken, so there isn't really anything to communicate on a permanent change of position there.
All right. So let me just add a bit on that. The HRMU and the DG's office has had quite a bit of challenges over the last few years. If you want to talk public sector reform, the various programs, the inability to deliver really on this idea that of that. What is there any assessment being done on the entire DG office in terms of is it fit for purpose? How are funds being managed or requested, managed, and then programs delivered?
Yeah, it's a really big subject, public sector reform, and in frankness, it's one that I feel I have not, in my time here as a governor, been able to sort of bite on decisively in the way I would have liked and should have done. And I think if I were to go back and ask many of my predecessors, I think probably they would have a somewhat similar response. So I think we all have to recognise that this is a big job. It's a big challenge. First of all, I would say that I have huge respect for the public service here. I know that may not always come over. As governor, sometimes you have to sort of issue a lot of instructions, and some things are about some tough decisions on funding and salaries and things. But overall, when you look at what people in Montserrat have to do to keep us safe and keep us working and keep our systems operating, I think people do a great job. When we had recently someone coming in from Canada, I think it was, to look at our land records, our land registry records. It's not a fantastically super duper modern building, but the comment was, goodness, you've got really careful, detailed records going back a long way. Yes, they're on paper, but they're really good. They're in good shape. And recently we've had a visitor here looking at our prison sort of reforms and how we can improve life for prisoners and scope to, sort of rehabilitate themselves. Actually, the view was that our small prison, in many respects, in its fundamentals, compares very well. Mood, opportunity, well-being, systems are, compare pretty well. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't obviously always look to improve, but sometimes we can be a bit negative about ourselves. And overall, I think the public service does a very good job and does it valiantly. So I would start with that. Our public service, though, is too complex. Our procedures are too complex and too antiquated and too bureaucratic. We need to be much lighter touch. We need to do less on paper. We need to be much more digital and much more joined up, less siloed about the way we do things. Those are significant cultural and attitudinal shifts. They're also process shifts, because you can't do those things until you've got better IT in place and easier means of communicating. And I think to our whole, and I know we've commented on this several times, the sort of whole grading structures and salary and allowance structures are just too complicated. It's a bit like bodies, my body probably, you know, you accrete lots of cholesterol and scars and damage and things over the years, and we've got too much. It's just too complex and far too many processes and allowances that we're not keeping up to date with. So we need a really rigorous, mind-cleansing simplification of our grades and salary structures. That's another thing we need in the public service. And we absolutely need to take on board a critical thing, which was, I'm sure, very well intentioned in Montserrat when it was set up. But the Public Service Commission does a great job. But by saying that any disciplinary and managerial action is sort of devolved then away from the line of command to the Public Service Commission, it undermines managerial grip, it undercuts managerial responsibility, and it lengthens processes. So, you know, say you have some incident in the office, somebody's misbehaved in some way, you need to sort it quickly. The senior manager needs to come in and say, that needs to stop, these are the standards, move on. That needs to happen. Too often in Montserrat, we become litigious, it goes to the Public Service Commission, people haven't kept a record of it all, so that's disputed and debated. And then the lawyers are brought into the Public Service Commission because people feel that's their right and they feel offended by it. The whole process becomes a bureaucratic juggernaut, and that is something we really need to lighten. Yes, you need the balance and assurance of an independent Public Service Commission for the most serious disciplinary matters and standards. But in general, the public service needs to run itself. It needs to run itself, and people need to step up to the plate at all levels and play their part in running itself. That goes to the heart of the Public Service Act, and that's why you can't just update it a little bit and put it to Parliament again. It needs root and branch reform, and in particular it needs a rebooting to give back more power, grip and decision making into the public service itself. That's a big task, and that's partly why on your first question about the changes in HR, we're in a bit of a sort of thinking pause mode for the moment. This will come up in the FAM, because it frankly needs much more resources. The sort of transformation we're talking about here cannot be done by me or the DG in 5% of our day at the end of a tired working day over a pot of tea. It needs a team, a serious intervention team to deliver it. So a major uplift in transformational resource. Mm-hmm. Sorry, that's a long answer, but it's an important question.
Yes, thank you for that. You mentioned about culture and the fact that it's about transforming the culture as well. There's also the challenge that we haven't had any salary increases in more than a decade. So, you know, in the scope of trying to now regrade the system, where's the opportunity for somebody to actually improve when there's no possibility of salary increase?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I appreciate that. I mean, the trouble is that the message that you give on that is right, I would say, but it's a bit concealed in the figures because our pay bill does go up. If you're sitting offshore here and you're looking at Montserrat's public service pay bill, it is not that it's been static for 9 or 10 years. It's gone up, I think, somewhere approaching 5% a year. And part of that is because of the increment system. In most countries, rightly or wrongly, the increment system has been abolished. In the UK, it was abolished 10, 15 years ago. When I joined the public service, we had that, and I thought it was a good system. But that's, but we've abolished it, and so you're paid a rate for the job. And if there's a pay increase that year, you get a pay increase. If there isn't, and public servants in the UK had a near 10-year pay freeze after the financial crisis in the 2008-9. You don't. But in Montserrat, the increment system means that a proportion of civil servants, not a majority, but a proportion do get that, and it feeds through to an observable increase in pay bill. Critically, you need to simplify. We need to simplify, and there needs to be some sort of macro deal where, in return for accepting radical simplifications, at least for people now joining the system afresh, it's usually not right to change things mid-course for people who are committed and have family commitments and things and expectations. But in return for a really significant rebooting of public service culture and the allowances and salary structures, then the gate needs to be opened to cost of living increases, because particularly right now they're very, very heavy on people. I think we all see that and feel that. So I very much support the message you give, and there is, without, I have to be careful because obviously some of this is elected ministers' responsibilities, and it would be wrong of me to stray too much into that, but in the FAM, one of the strategic face-to-face discussions is on public sector pay and conditions, and this needs to be seen as part of the package that you're raising.
Your Excellency, just following on public sector reform. We've been having issues or concerns with information not being passed on to the public, and you would appreciate that the public has a right to know. When we reassign people or reposition them, you know, the public needs to know that these individuals are no longer in that particular post. And we need to sort that out in terms of the reform process. Now, the Public Admin Act, which gives teeth to the whole reformation process, I know that we were looking at some form of legislation to support that act. Where are we in terms of that? Because we have not been having much progress where the reformation process is concerned.
Yeah, thanks, James. I mean, on the Public Administration Act side, work was going on with a series of sort of more or less minor adjustments and reforms to the text when I first arrived here. And I went with that agenda, as did the DG. But we got to a point in our discussions on public sector reform, including with the I thought, very good UK National School of Government, now GPI, Government Partnerships International, but they were, I think, a very good partner for us, where we, and this goes back really to the point we were discussing a moment ago, that the reforms needed are really structural. So if you were saying that there needs to be a redefinition of the scope of responsibility of the Public Service Commission versus the responsibilities for line management, performance management and disciplinary management of the line of public service command and control, so PermSecs, directors, etc., then that really goes to the heart of the structure of the Public Administration Act. And so we decided that this was beyond our scope to rewrite it in that structural way for the moment, so we parked it whilst we've been taking forward a series of useful but more sort of incremental building block reforms, things like whistleblowing, grievance procedures, disciplinary systems actually, where we're looking to make some adjustments even short of the full structural shift. And so we've parked that work on that. That doesn't mean it's not important. At the end, that's going to have to come in because you can't operate outside the legal framework. This is a more personal comment because it's not for me to say, but I think what is needed is we complete the current phase of important reforms. We then bring in a sort of transformational team to help drive the necessary real structural reform, including a revision, a full-scale revision of the Act you're describing. And then that goes to Parliament and we move on with a new structure backed by a new terms and conditions agreement with the public service. So that would be my personal view. Obviously, that's going to take some time to come to fruition, and there'll be a more immediate question of appropriate adjustments for people suffering some hardship in the public and private sectors. Then your other question's a little different, isn't it? The communications one, and I know media have several times asked me that, and I'm sorry if I'm perhaps not quite perceiving the problem. Maybe we need a different press meeting. We might have a discussion with perhaps DG and HR on this. See, because I think I'm maybe not quite getting, not quite biting on the problem. But if you take the norm, I mean, I've been in the public sector a long time. The sort of what's become the established norm is that at certain grades, normally it's director and above, those positions are publicised. In some cases, their salary package in range is is publicised as well. And so every time there's a change in those positions, they're put on a website, a government website. In the UK, obviously, there's a lot of directors, so some people it's a bit of a yawn. You don't want to read all that, but it's there. Below that, it isn't normal to publicise those changes. I think it's because there's a feeling that, and this is not in a small island, but in general, it's a bit too micro. It would be far too much information. And there's a sort of sense of personal privacy. You know, sometimes when you director and above, you accept as part of the job a public persona and a public scrutiny, whereas, you know, folks who are clerk or registry manager or something, you're not expecting all that, and people can feel a bit intimidated and oppressed by it. So the general best practice in public services that I've seen is you set a level. Above that, it's publicised in broad terms, not precise salary, etc. Below that, it isn't. You have numbers. So there are 100 people in the Afghan unit, there are 50 people in the Syria unit, but you don't say all their names and things. And I honestly think, I know Montserrat is special, it is special, but I think even with a small island community like ours, I think that's a good principle to follow. And we maybe don't come right down to director, but we certainly have perm sec. Everything is published here. It's published partly through the budget process, and then that's approved in Parliament, so numbers of staff under each line ministry. I would have thought that's not bad, but I sense you're still not happy, so I do think we should set up a separate, maybe with some prepared questions this time, because there are clearly issues from the community, there are things you want to hear about that we're not feeding through. I mean, can I suggest that? Can we, or maybe if you guys want to write the questions a bit more fully, you know, what are the examples of these positions that you're not seeing communicated properly?
Yes, sir. Yeah. We'll take you up on that one, sir. I want to just move on to, we're still on reform, and the calls for electoral reform. And clearly, there's the saying that, you know, the current system that we have is not fit for purpose. And is the Electoral Reform Commission, is it still functioning, and is it truly constituted? You know, and when will this commission submit its report? I don't know what the position is with that, so you can lighten our darkness there.
Right. Okay. I'm not very good at lightening darkness. Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's perhaps a little bit odd to have an electoral commission and an electoral reform commission, but for whatever reasons, Montserrat has had that. And I remember receiving a very good report from the Electoral Reform Commission, crikey, and that must be nearly a couple of years ago. Time whizzes by, and I was very grateful to it, and they'd thought very carefully about it and tried hard. The 2019 election, I was asked a few times the question you've asked, and I sort of ventured on a personal basis, which was perhaps a little unwise, that it seemed to me quite complex for the average Montserratian. These great long lists of folks, and you have to pick 9, or you can pick less than 9, and then there's questions about how many votes you've actually cast. Is it your ballot, or is it how many individual candidates you've ticked against? It does seem quite a complicated system. So I must admit my instinct was that there could be merit. It's obviously Montserrat's own decision entirely, not mine or UK's, but there could be merit in a simplification and a sort of reconnection, because if you simplify the scale of the balloting, then you can, by having more simpler constituencies, you can connect people in a constituency to their MP in a better way than having everybody representing everybody else. So I like that idea, and we reflected in Cabinet after the 2019 elections, based on excellent advice from the Electoral Reform Commission, also from a body called the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. They gave a very good report, and also from the Electoral Commission. Everybody kindly gave us views. And to cut a long story short, we felt we needed further public consultation. We thought that the changes needed are not something we could determine based on the evidence and level of consultation to that point. So there'd been some good consultation done, but to put it frankly, we felt it needed to be wider at all levels in society, that it had been a little bit perhaps narrowly based. Nobody's fault, but that happens. So we have asked the Electoral Commission to draw up proposals for us for a fuller, deeper and more digitally savvy public consultation. So we're making sure we include people of all natures, and not everyone listens to the radio, not everyone does the stuff on social media, but to pick up all of that, and indeed the diaspora, and get back to us with a series of, broadly costed recommendations as to adjustments that would help us here. And the Electoral Commission, I understand, are working away on that. We do need to take it forward, because I know the next elections seem a long way off still, but the preparation needed for constituency changes and fundamental changes of the sort we may possibly be recommended to do does take time. So we need to crack on, but that's formally the position. And the Electoral Reform Commission does remain in being, as I understand it, but this proposal for a fresh, invigorated and wider public consultation is being led by the Electoral Commission.
Okay, sir. So another topical issue has to do with sand miners.
Yeah.
And they're still complaining about access to better quality material, which they need to export, basically. And they were promised access to areas in Zone V. There appears to be some dragging of feet, and people are laying the blame squarely at your feet. So what's the position with that?
Poor old governors, they do get the blame for a lot of things, don't they? Sand mining is not one of them. Cabinet and the body called ND PRAC, the National Disaster Preparedness Committee, looked at the proposals for sand mining to extend into parts of Zone V, two parts of Zone V, the Upper Bellam Valley and the Gat that comes up from Plymouth Pier, which I've now forgotten the name of, Fort Gat I think it's called. It looked at that, and obviously that needed a careful judgment, because how many years is it? 26 years since the volcano erupted. We haven't sanctioned permanent activity of that sort inside Zone V since that time, for good reason. So we needed very careful advice, and we got advice from the Volcano Observatory. Excellent advice. They took a lot of time to give us a very careful quantitative study of the risks involved. And we got some other advice, and the companies, the sand mining companies themselves, gave good advice on the measures they could take. So we reflected on all that, and we took the decision to approve both those areas of Zone V. But that's sort of, okay, so we give the approval to the principal, but then what is required, and this is a lead by the Mali, the Ministry of Agriculture, Housing and Lands and the Environment, they then need to deal with the process. So they need to deal with the necessary planning permission applications that you have to have for any activity of that sort. They need to make sure that the environmental impact assessment has been done. Ministry of Environment, that's their lead. And they need to make sure that the land is properly surveyed, so we know who owns the land we're going to have miners working on. That survey has not been done. It needs to be done, as I understand it, not least because the landowners have their own rights, but also then there's a question of the royalty payments or tax payments. They need to go to the right people. And then there's a final aspect of it, which is the question of fairness, because it's not for me, it's for the Ministry of Environment, but if you have sand miners and you say, right, you can go into the Upper Bellam, well, who goes in? Who goes in on what day? Who can dig how much? Do we have two trucks arguing over who's going to have this boulder or that piece of sand? So there needs to be a proper fair licensing system so that it isn't some crazy free-for-all there. And the responsibility for all those things is not the governor. I don't know who's saying that's at the governor's, but this governor's office and this governor are not responsible for those things. The relevant ministry is Ministry of Agriculture, Housing, Land and Environment, and they do need to complete that work. And they are on the case, and Cabinet has asked them for an update. Cabinet has asked that ministry for an update on how it's getting on. So that's the formal position.
Is there a time frame of sorts when you think that might be the process might be completed?
Well, from my perspective, I'd like to see it completed as soon as possible, because there's no benefit in letting it sort of hang around. We want to see the process done, and then everybody can get on with it, and we can make sure some good work is done and the benefits are seen, and it's done in a controlled way. So I have no interest in it being done other than quickly, but it does also need to be done properly, because sometimes there's a little bit of history where people have not done these things properly, and it's led to problems and legal challenges, and the government's lost. The government has lost the legal challenges because it hasn't done it properly. So they need to do the work quickly but properly.
All right, thank you so much, Your Excellency, and I think we've exhausted our questions for the moment. We need to go back and, take another look at certain topics, and then we'll revert.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for affording us this opportunity. Okay. I say thank you on behalf of my colleague, Nerissa Golden of Golden Media, and of course, our technicians.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed for coming and setting it all up quietly and efficiently. Sorry, we're a bit short-handed today in the office, but thank you very much. And on the communication issue, I am conscious we've had a lot of discussion of that, and we do need a really good focus on it. I do think that it's probably DG, HR, and GIU, isn't it? Why don't we bring all that lot together and try and thrash this thing out, what it is, where the processes are not working. Realistically, next week is totally FAM-dominated, isn't it? We've got the press conference on Friday morning, and then it's the Christmas week, so we're probably, frankly, looking after Christmas, aren't we?
Yes, sir.
But why don't we see what we can do? Because I'm conscious that's not one I've been able to answer for several press conferences. Let's have a good talk. Maybe actually sometimes part of it can be switch the mics off. You know what I mean? Just have a mic, an open bit, but just have a chat through what exactly this issue is, face to face over a pot of tea or something.
Yeah, we'll appreciate that very much, Your Excellency.
I'll fix that up.
Thank you very much again for affording us this opportunity.
Thank you very much, folks.